As Congress continues to fight about whether to raise the debt ceiling on our $31.5 trillion of debt, so many of you have asked me, well, who do we owe all this money to? You want me to tell you? Come here. No, it's not China. So before I get into who we owe, I need to explain how the debt works. The national debt is the amount of money the federal government has borrowed to cover Congress's spending over time. Think of it this way. The national debt is sort of like using your credit card to buy stuff and then not paying off the full balance every month. So you start to accrue all this interest and your debt just gets bigger and bigger. So the reality looks like this. The U.S. government almost always outspends what it brings in, and that results in a yearly deficit. To pay for this deficit and keep the government operating, the Treasury Department has to borrow money by selling securities, including Treasury bonds, among many other things. Sometimes they're simply called treasuries. The national debt is the accumulation of all this borrowing plus the interest owed to the investors who buy these securities or treasuries. Does that make sense? So who buys these things? The majority? Domestic investors in the U.S. and other U.S. government agencies. But foreign governments and investors outside the U.S. also buy them. Why? Because it's a sure bet. The United States never defaults on that debt, so it's basically a guaranteed investment win, especially over time. So back to who we owe. The fact is the vast majority, about 80%, is owed to, well, us. And by us, I mean domestic holders like other United States government agencies and the U.S. public. I'm talking about holders like the Federal Reserve, Social Security, mutual funds, pension funds, state and local governments, military retirement funds, insurance companies, and domestic investors who, for example, buy savings bonds. Maybe it's easier to show it to you this way. So as of May 2023, the U.S. is sitting on almost $31.5 trillion in debt. The Treasury Department breaks it down into two main categories. There's the publicly held debt, and then there's this intra-government debt. Intra-government debt is U.S. debt held by other U.S. government agencies. So that accounts for about 22% of our debt holders, our other government agencies. The biggest one? Social Security. Then you go to this publicly held debt, and that includes all of the insurance companies and pension funds and retirement funds and private U.S. investors. But also here in the publicly held debt are the foreign investors. If you want to look at it another way, back in January of this year, when the U.S. was sitting on $31.35 trillion in debt, the Treasury Department reported that of that number, $7.4 trillion of it was held by foreign governments and foreign investors. That's about 24% of the overall U.S. debt held by a foreign entity. That left 76% of our debt being held by domestic investors and other intra-government agencies. So the question is, which countries are holding this $7.4 trillion? I know this is the graphic you all want to see. So it turns out the foreign country that owns the most U.S. debt is our ally, Japan. Japan owns about 15% of that $7.4 trillion as of January 2023. Coming in at second, China, which owns 11.6% of U.S. debt, and the UK, which owns about 9%. But you can see there are all these other countries that also invest in U.S. debt. And over the last 20 years, China and Japan have by far held the most U.S. debt. Though I will say, over the last 10 years, China's holdings in U.S. debt have decreased significantly. Now, overall foreign investment in the United States debt has increased a lot over the years. In the 1970s, only about 5% of our debt was held by foreign countries. And now, as I just showed you, we're looking more like about 30%. But why do these foreign countries and investors want to own U.S. debt? Well, it's pretty advantageous for them to hold on to U.S. dollars because, well, most importantly, as I said before, it's a sure bet because we never default, and because it's the world's currency, so it's super helpful, especially when it comes to international trade and transactions. Owning U.S. treasuries can also give foreign governments and investors a higher rate of return compared to other governments who issue bonds worldwide.